On a routine journey from Singapore to Perth, the primary flight computers of Qantas Flight 72 began to experience malfunctions, resulting in the aircraft unexpectedly pitching downward toward the Indian Ocean. With over 300 passengers aboard, the aircraft suddenly entered a perilous nosedive. The violent negative G-forces caused unsecured items and individuals to crash against the cabin ceiling, leading to more than 100 injuries, including spinal injuries and fractures. This distressing incident features Captain Kevin Sullivan, who, drawing upon his elite military training, strives to regain control of the aircraft. The question remains, will his efforts be successful, or will the flight meet a tragic end in the Indian Ocean? This is the account of Qantas Flight 72, which took place on October 7, 2008. At 1:25 a.m., 303 passengers and 12 crew members boarded Qantas Flight 72 at Singapore's Changi Airport. The aircraft assigned to this flight was an Airbus A330, which had been delivered to Qantas on November 26, 2003. This large-capacity, wide-body twin-engine aircraft is designed for medium to long-haul flights and underwent an engine upgrade in November 2004. With a total of 20,000 operational hours, Flight 72 was scheduled to fly from Singapore to Perth, Australia, typically taking about 5 hours. After being pushed back from the gate, the pilots started the engines and began their taxi toward the runway, which they reached shortly thereafter. The cockpit crew comprised 3 pilots, with Captain Kevin Sullivan, a 53-year-old former U.S. Navy Top Gun pilot, leading the team. Captain Sullivan, known informally as the Magnet due to his tendency to encounter misfortune, had accumulated over 13,000 flight hours. He was accompanied by First Officer Peter Lippett, a former Royal Australian Navy helicopter pilot with nearly 12,000 flight hours. Also in the cockpit was Second Officer Hyles, who provided additional support for the lengthy journey to Perth and back, contributing 270 flying hours to the team. After receiving clearance for takeoff, Captain Sullivan advanced the thrust levers to initiate the takeoff procedure. Just minutes into the flight, the master caution alarm activated. The first officer glanced at the captain and quipped, "Here we go, it starts. I'm not sure if I should be flying with you, Kev, given your reputation." In response, Captain Sullivan engaged the autopilot, having been manually flying the aircraft until that point. This allowed them to concentrate on diagnosing the issue at hand. The first officer canceled the master caution, and they both focused on the fault message displayed on the ECAM, which indicated an air engine bleed 1 fault. When such an engine bleed fault arises, the ECAM not only alerts the pilots but also provides detailed, step-by-step instructions for addressing the issue and reconfiguring the aircraft. Within minutes, the first officers successfully rectified the problem, and the flight proceeded as scheduled. However, this was merely the onset of their difficulties. True to his nickname, the captain would face further challenges throughout the flight as Flight 72 continued its journey. At an altitude of 37,000 feet above the Indian Ocean, having just flown past Indonesia, Captain Sullivan took a scheduled break. He relocated to the crew rest area just outside the cockpit and began watching 2.5 men, completely unaware of the impending turmoil. During the captain's absence, the second officer managed the flight, and the next hour passed without incident. At 4:33 a.m., Captain Sullivan returned to the cockpit, greeted by a clear day with the Australian coastline visible in the distance. He requested the second officer to switch seats, reclaiming his position in the left seat while the second officer went to the restroom. Shortly after this handover, the first officer departed for his scheduled rest break, leaving the captain alone in the cockpit. Just 40 seconds later, the second officer returned from the restroom and took his place at the controls. As soon as he secured his seatbelt, their terrifying ordeal commenced. Suddenly, one of the aircraft's 3 air data inertial reference units began transmitting erroneous data to the flight computer. This malfunction led to the autopilot disengaging, and the crew was inundated with numerous warnings and caution alerts. As Captain Sullivan struggled to regain control, he activated the second autopilot. Within moments, the situation in the cockpit escalated dramatically, with the master warning and master caution alarms accompanied by the simultaneous blaring of overspeed and stall warnings. The circumstances appeared dire. The aircraft was issuing warnings to the crew, indicating that it was simultaneously flying at both excessive and insufficient speeds. Amidst these alerts, none of the primary instruments provided clear insights into the root cause of the issue, leaving the crew in a state of confusion. Their situation was further complicated when the airspeed and altitude readings on the captain's primary flight display began to fluctuate erratically, raising concerns about the reliability of the displayed information. Compounding the difficulties, the navigation display, which typically showed the map, failed to present any data due to a loss of heading information. Confronted with multiple concurrent challenges, the crew's anxiety regarding the dependability of the aircraft's navigation and control systems intensified, suggesting a potential malfunction of the flight computers. Captain Sullivan recognized that they were facing a situation characterized by unreliable airspeed. He promptly disconnected the autopilot, doubting its ability to safely manage the aircraft without accurate speed and altitude data. Taking manual control, he endeavored to stabilize the aircraft at an altitude of 37,000 feet, utilizing the side stick with his left hand and the thrust levers with his right. He relied on the standby instruments and the first officer's displays, which seemed to be operating correctly. The captain instructed the second officer to summon the first officer back to the flight deck to assist in diagnosing and addressing the issues. During this process, the aircraft unexpectedly pitched. The captain faced a situation perceived as an imminent stall due to the aircraft's flight envelope protection system, which restricts operations beyond safe limits. Despite attempts to issue pitch-up commands, the captain was unable to override this command, and the aircraft did not respond, significantly complicating efforts to stabilize the flight. The aircraft experienced a sudden drop, resulting in a moment of weightlessness that caused unsecured individuals to be thrown against the ceiling, leading to injuries and damage to the overhead fittings. Given the uncertainty regarding the potential recurrence of the malfunction, the second officer promptly activated the seatbelt sign and subsequently made a public address announcement instructing all passengers and crew to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Once the aircraft stabilized at flight level 370, the flight crew began procedures to address multiple ECAM caution messages indicating various issues with the aircraft systems. Despite the overwhelming number of alerts, the pilots remained focused, addressing each issue methodically. The second officer concentrated on resolving the fault messages while Captain Sullivan continued to pilot the aircraft. After addressing several fault messages, the crew encountered another issue that required them to turn off Flight Control Primary Computer 3 and then turn it back on. The crew successfully completed this action and cleared the message. However, immediately after resetting FCPC-3, the aircraft initiated a second pitch-down movement, reaching a maximum pitch angle of approximately 3.5 degrees nose down. The captain responded promptly, applying back pressure on his side stick to counteract the downward pitch movement. However, his initial efforts produced no effect, mirroring the earlier incident as the aircraft continued its descent. Instincts honed from years of flying took over, and for the second time, he glanced toward the Indian Ocean, gripping the unresponsive side stick and contemplating whether this was the end. He could feel his heart racing beneath his shirt, experiencing a level of fear unprecedented in his career, despite having undertaken perilous missions and confronted life-threatening situations. After a significant drop of nearly 400 feet over 16 seconds, the aircraft finally began to respond. Captain Sullivan gently pulled the nose upward, mindful that sudden movements could cause serious injuries to the passengers. His inputs on the side stick were measured and deliberate as he maneuvered the aircraft back to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The second officer reported a primary threefold once again, but this time the captain instructed him to refrain from any adjustments. Concurrently, the captain observed a troubling issue: the trim wheel was inoperative. It was suspected that the flight control system had reverted to direct law, eliminating standard protections such as angle of attack, overspeed, and bank angle safeguards. The pilots were now required to manually trim the aircraft. The Airbus A330 features a trimmable horizontal stabilizer, a movable section of the horizontal stabilizer that can be adjusted up or down to modify the aircraft's pitch attitude. The absence of continuous pilot input considerably alleviated the pilot's workload and assisted in maintaining a stable flight trajectory. Fortunately, the aircraft continued to operate normally even in the absence of auto trim. The captain made the decision to disconnect the autothrust to mitigate potential complications arising from inaccurate air data that could affect the electronic engine control units. He then manually piloted the aircraft without the aid of autopilot or autothrust, relying exclusively on the standby instruments for the remainder of the flight. A $250 million aircraft was reduced to the simplicity of a Cessna. Despite successfully keeping the aircraft airborne, the master warning was sounding incessantly, akin to a revolver, accompanied by a barrage of constant ECAM messages. When a message appeared on the ECAM, the pilots had a limited window to respond. However, these messages were transient, appearing and disappearing amidst ongoing stall and overspeed warnings. The relentless auditory alerts, which could not be muted, proved to be a significant distraction. Eventually, they became background noise, raising concerns about the possibility of missing a critical warning. After a brief period of calm, the captain made a public announcement to the cabin, informing passengers that the crew was addressing flight control issues and advising everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. The first officer had not yet returned to the cockpit following the second pitch down and was injured, with Peter suspecting a broken nose. Access to the cockpit could only be granted once conditions stabilized sufficiently to perform the access procedure, which takes approximately 20 seconds, given the extensive damage throughout the aircraft. Peter inquired whether the door could be opened, and after a few minutes, the first officer successfully returned to the cockpit, taking over from the second officer who moved to the third occupant seat. The first officer remarked that he could not leave the crew unattended for even 2 minutes. The crew engaged in a discussion with the captain, who voiced his concerns regarding the potential for another sudden pitch down, particularly at a lower altitude. He expressed apprehension that the flight computers might override his commands again, which could render the aircraft uncontrollable and lead to a crash. Consequently, the crew concluded that landing the aircraft as soon as possible was imperative. They recognized that Learmonth was relatively nearby and deemed it a suitable destination for an A330 landing. Learmonth Airport, situated near Exmouth in Western Australia, typically accommodated air transport aircraft and was designated as an alternate airport for international flights. The airport featured a single sealed runway measuring 3,470 meters in length and 45 meters in width, equipped with runway and approach lighting, a precision approach path indicator, and non-precision navigational aids. However, it lacked fire rescue services, a control tower, and airline services. After observing the turmoil in the cabin, Peter proposed declaring a mayday. The captain, however, deemed it unnecessary and opted to declare a pan instead. Numerous injuries were reported, particularly in the rear of the aircraft, where the negative G-forces were more pronounced at 4:49 a.m. The first officer initiated a broadcast to air traffic control, informing them of issues with the flight control computer and that several passengers had sustained injuries. He requested permission to divert the flight and head directly to Lyon. Meanwhile, the second officer attempted to reach the flight attendant located at the rear of the aircraft through the intercom, only to find that she was too injured to respond. Fortunately, 2 off-duty crew members on board were able to assist, reporting multiple severe injuries, including spinal injuries and fractures. Upon receiving this information, the captain instructed the first officer to declare a mayday while coordinating the diversion to Lyon. The flight crew took the opportunity to reassess the situation, reviewing the events that had transpired, their current status, and the ECAM messages. They noted the persistent fault messages for NAVIR1 and FCTL-PRIM3, along with several other caution alerts, concluding that the ECAM was not providing useful information or recommended actions. As a result, the first officer reached out to the operator's maintenance watch unit in Sydney via satellite communication to update them on the situation and request assistance. However, the support received was inadequate, prompting the captain to instruct him to terminate the call. The maintenance watch indicated that the Air Data Inertial Reference Unit 1 seemed to be linked to the fault messages displayed, but they also noted conflicting information regarding elevator control, offering no recommended actions at that time. In a later discussion, Maintenance Watch suggested further steps. The crew, exercising their discretion, opted to deactivate Flight Control Primary Computer 3. Following a discussion regarding this recommendation, they proceeded to switch off the computer. This action did not impact the scrolling ECAM messages, stall warnings, or overspeed warnings. In addition to liaising with maintenance, air traffic control, and the cabin crew, the flight crew collaborated effectively to ensure the captain received all necessary information for operating the aircraft. They also faced the challenge of managing various issues related to the aircraft systems. Due to fault messages linked to the Global Positioning System units, the flight crew was unable to input an ARAV approach into the flight management computer, which presented an additional challenge as they were uncertain about the aircraft's response amid multiple system failures. The second officer was required to manually regulate cabin pressure during the descent because of a fault in the pressurization system. Furthermore, the crew recognized the necessity of employing manual braking for landing due to an auto brake malfunction. To facilitate the descent for landing, the captain executed wide left orbits to maintain the aircraft's speed below 330 knots, descending cautiously to prevent triggering another unexpected pitch-down event. Throughout this maneuver, he kept the runway in sight, as the absence of electronic maps necessitated visual identification of the airport for navigation. The crew completed the approach checklist and performed a flight control check above 10,000 feet to assess the aircraft's response, including the flaps. Given their uncertainty regarding the aircraft's reactions, they proceeded with caution as they continued their descent. An aircraft was approximately 28 kilometers away, preparing for a straight-in visual approach to runway 36. As the pilots readied for landing, they encountered significant challenges, with several systems rendered inoperative and the aircraft's behavior becoming increasingly unpredictable. Additionally, a sudden pitch down at their current altitude could have resulted in catastrophic consequences. Fortunately, the landing gear extended without any issues. The second officer armed the ground spoilers and deployed the third notch of flaps, ensuring the aircraft was adequately configured for landing. These adjustments enhanced stability and control as they neared the runway. The final moments of the approach were particularly tense, with the potential for further complications looming. The cockpit atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and silence enveloped the cabin. Ultimately, at 5:32 a.m., the aircraft successfully touched down at Lehman, marking the conclusion of a harrowing ordeal for all on board. Remarkably, stall and overspeed warnings continued to sound even after landing, despite the violent maneuvers experienced. Miraculously, all 315 individuals on board survived, although 119 sustained injuries, some of which were serious. In the hours that followed, the most critically injured passengers were airlifted to hospitals in Perth for urgent medical attention. In summary, the pilot's skill in safely landing the aircraft under such distressing circumstances is truly commendable and averted a potentially disastrous outcome. However, the experience took a toll on Captain Sullivan, who later documented his ordeal in a book. Providing insight into the challenges faced during the flight and the crew's heroic efforts, especially the moment after landing when he walked through his aircraft to inspect the damage he calls it the walk. That changed his life. Ultimately, Sullivan made the difficult decision to retire from flying, influenced by the profound impact of the incident on his life and career. The impact of the incident was also significant for passengers and other crew members even to this day.